Hello. Um, well, here we are. This is the second office hour and the final office hour for this ECN 211 course on earned admissions here at ASU. Well, here we are. This is the, you're hearing me echo because I'm listening to myself. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to answer a question about the study guide. Namely, there were some of you who asked, is there a study guide for this class that helps me study for the final? There's no formal study guide, but I will basically consider this office hour your study guide for the final. So I'll cover not only the material that you've seen so far, but I'll dive a little bit into the material also for next week and the week after, so that you have a complete overview of what's going to come in the course going forward. With that in mind, let me double check one thing so that I'm actually showing you the whole course. Okay, so with that in mind, let's start reviewing the course. You are now pretty much at the end of it, but you're going to work on the last week next week. So what I'll do is this. I gave you an office hour before, so in the previous office hour, which is also available on the course side, I covered material through the midterm plus week 4. In fact, a large part of that office hour is about week 4. I'll very briefly review that, and then we'll largely discuss what was done in week 5 that you've completed last week, week 6 that you're working on right now, and week 7. Now, through all of this, let me do one thing. Let me share my screen with you and show you what we did was, before I start the review, what we did was we opened up part of the course material at the end called Part 7.2, and that's effectively a study guide. So we made that part for you to help you review for the final, although from some of your comments on the discussion board, I realized that could have been useful as well, helping you prepare for the midterm. But we made it available early for you so that you can use it to prepare for the final. So I'm going to go through that first so that you know what's in there, and then I'll go through each of the individual parts of the course, very briefly again through part week 4, but mostly weeks 5, 6, and then week 7, which is to come next week. And mostly part 7.1, because part 7.2 is this review part. Okay, I'll disappear and I'll turn on the part of the course that matters. So let me share my screen with you. So this is the course content. As I see it, you will see it slightly differently. There's no major secrets. So there's a few different parts of content that you might not see. Most importantly, this includes part 7.1 that you haven't seen yet, but that you'll see next week, and I'll discuss now. But part 7.2 on the course content is a part that is already open, the conclusion of the course. And most importantly, what I highlighted here for you is the review part of the course. That's useful for you as a study guide for the final when you prepare. So let me go through that first, and then we will we'll go back and we will revisit each of the course parts. So if you click review, you're going to get this particular set of content. There's a video that is made by by Jared Gruff, who is the TA on this, who used to be the TA on this course, and one of the co-designers of this course. And I had him record this video because he actually teaches economic principles to high school students and has been a college student himself recently. So he'll tell you a little bit in his own experience what to focus on, how to study, as a peer advised, and rather hearing it from me. So that's the first part. Then the second part contains a set of key concepts that are covered in the course. And this is really where what I really would advise you to go through. Now, it doesn't go through things in great detail. It reiterates the structure of the course, what's in it, how we start off with the circular flow model, which was already covered in your midterm, how we then think about measuring GDP, and then how we think about 4 sectors that make up GDP, and then it talks through each of those sectors. households, which you already covered in the midterm, firms, and then markets. And that was kind of the material that's been covered in the midterm. Now, after markets, what we did was we start thinking about when markets sometimes don't work. So when do markets work and when they don't work? That was still part of 3.2, but then in 4.1, we looked at 3 particular markets that did not work very well, or at least were subject to big distortions, externalities, and frictions. Remember, those were the markets for public goods and quasi-public goods. Those were the markets, the market for knowledge and education and intellectual property, and then the market for medical care. So we covered those. And then we also looked at the labor market. And then subsequently what we did was we started thinking through, the other sectors of the economy. So basically what happened was in the midterm, we basically covered households, firms, and we covered how they kind of interact in markets. And then what we did after the midterms is we covered the government in part 5, financial institutions in part 6, and the rest of the world in part 7. So there we are. And so for the government, the first thing we did was we looked at the public finances. How do we actually measure income? How do we measure income of the government, which is mainly due to taxes, and then the spending of the government on government purchases and transfers? And then we also thought about, what does that result in? If tax revenue falls short of the spending in terms of the government purchase and transfer, what does the government need to do? It needs to borrow money and accumulate debt. And that's what we did in part 5.1. Then in part 5.2, we looked at how these instruments, basically, think of it as these 3 arrows, taxes, transfers, and government purchases, and implicitly government debt, could be used by the government to pursue both long-run and short-run goals. Then the next thing we did is what you're working on now in part 6 is think about financial institutions. So what we didn't do before was we didn't really think through what the role of money was in the macroeconomy. And so that's what we do in part 6, and that's what you're thinking through right now this week. So the first thing is to really think more big picture question: what is money exactly? And then the second thing is to ask yourself, once you realize what the role of money is, how do financial institutions, now most notably banks, as well as the central bank, intervene in the market for money and intermediate between lenders and borrowers in order to basically facilitate transactions between savers and investors, and at the same time, how does that contribute both to the economy as well as has an inherent risk that the financial system could become unstable, and what instruments can we use to assure the stability of the financial system, and on top of that, use some of the instruments, most notably the short-term interest rate in the overnight interbank borrowing money market, known as the Fed funds market, to basically set interest rates in the economy, or at least partially set short-term interest rates. That's done by the Federal Reserve. Then what we'll do next week is we'll look at the rest of the world. So we'll look at how do we measure transactions with the rest of the world, namely how do we combine data on imports and exports. And then also, on top of that, how do we look at the offsetting financial flows, where if we export stuff, abroad, to abroad because the rest of the world demands stuff that we produce, then how do they pay for the goods or services they buy, and vice versa. So the part on the rest of the world next week contains basically three parts. One is how do you account for international transactions, not only the goods and services that flow across borders, but also the offsetting payments. Then the next thing is, why would it be beneficial to even trade and to have goods and services flow across borders between countries? Why is trade such a beneficial thing? And why do economists think that trade is such a beneficial thing? And then there's a discussion in there, kind of who benefits more and who benefits less from trade. And then the third thing is, more on the international finance side, is the question about how do trade flows and which markets then determine the value of the dollar compared to other currencies. And that's largely determined by trade flows and international investment flows. So that's basically what's covered in the course, and most notably, of course, we're covering mainly for the final, mainly these three things, with a little bit of market imperfections in it that we covered in part 4 that I went through in the previous office hour. So let's go back to the key concepts review in the review part in 7.2. So the first, it discusses the public finance side, and then it discusses fiscal policies, the long run and short run effects of fiscal policies that we cover in part 5.2. Then it looks at the role of money and the purpose of money and the types of money we had historically. Now, if there's one part of this course that I would put a little bit less emphasis on when I would review things for the final, it's this part 6.1. There are some questions on the final in part 6.1, but I think you can answer those with a quick read of the part pretty easily. So you don't have to know all the details as much, and the material is not that involved. Then in part 6.2, we're going to look at the financial system and how the Federal Reserve's decisions affect the stability of the financial system, as well as the movements of interest rates, and how those movements of interest rates can help stabilize the economy and alleviate business cycle fluctuations. And then the final thing is part 7.1, and that wasn't covered in this review section because that's the thing you're actually going to do exactly in the same week that you would open this, or you look at this review section. And that's the part on international trade. But I already reviewed that with you, and we will do a little bit more in the next 40 minutes. So read through the review section. That's useful. Then Jared recorded a little video, which I think is very appropriate, where he basically did a little self-reflection and asked himself, what were my stumbling blocks? And what we did was actually we had a little discussion about it at Jared's request, and so watch that video in which Jared and I basically discussed the difficulties we had ourselves learning macroeconomic principles, and I hope that helps you as well. By hearing the stuff that we thought was difficult, it probably helps you think about what to focus on when you study. And the next thing is something I teach every time I teach students, no matter whether it's in class or online, and that's about tackling the exam. And I want to say something about this. So let me just click on this picture and talk you through tackling the exam. The exam you're seeing here on the picture is an in-person exam, but online exams and in-person exams are largely the same in many strategies. So what I'd like you to do is be aware of a couple of things. No matter whether I teach undergraduate students or students who take undergraduate classes like yourself, or I teach PhD students, or I teach MBA students or master's students, I always ask them the same questions, and I'm going to ask them to you. Now, you can't answer them to me in person, but think about them. The first question is, if you get an exam, do you start with the first question? Do you start with the last question? Where do you start? What do you do when you get handed the exam? Now, online, that depends on how the exam is delivered. But in our case, you can see every single question that's on the exam. You know how much time you have. You know how many questions there are going to be. That's all in the course information, the course syllabus, so look that up. But you know that information. So what I want you to do is have a strategy. At the end, your goal is to maximize your score on the exam. And I can give you a study guide, I can give you pointers, I can do all of that. But at the end of the day, what's most important is that when you sit down and you do this exam, you have a goal in mind. And so the first thing to realize is that starting with the first question and working your way down the exam is probably not the optimal strategy. And when I ask students, do you start with the first question and do you work your way down? Even at the graduate student level, at least a third of students say, yes, that's what I do. I get the exam, I start at the beginning, and then I work to the end. Now, if there's one thing you take away from this course, and it doesn't even have to do with economics, is that you shouldn't do that if you can see all the questions at the same time. Now, there are exams where that's not the case, and which you cannot do that. And then you have to have a different strategy. But if you can get all the questions at the same time, no matter whether they're on paper or whether they're on a web page, strategize and figure out, go through those questions and figure out which of the questions are easiest for you to answer and answer those first. So kind of classify. While you're browsing through those questions, mentally classify which questions look obvious to you, which questions look a little harder and you have to think about it, and which questions are going to be tough ones. When you do that, and you've browsed through the whole exam, then you first tackle the ones that are the easiest. Now, this seems to be an obvious advice. You might be listening to me and thinking, yeah. I think I totally understand it. But when you get nervous and you've never done this before, this might not be as obvious as you think. So have that mindset. When you do so, the students that do so generally score substantially better than the students that start from the beginning. So that's point one. Point two is, for every question then, how can you assess whether you're comfortable with the questions or not? And there is what question is obvious to you and what question is not. And there, of course, the experience in the course, and there's more than 200 questions in this course, so we are very confident that you enter the exam with enough practice. There, what you would like to really think about then is this a topic I've studied intensively, or is this a topic where I've looked at, but it's something that I'm not so familiar with? Or is this something that really I either studied and I thought it was confusing and I still don't particularly understand it, or I just didn't look at it? And there is a large volume of material in this course. So having a couple of questions on the exam where you think, you know what, I must have missed that somewhere in the course, that happens. It doesn't only happen when you study, it happens when you have a job. You can know everything. So that's A-okay. A good grade should be a goal. Perfection is not necessarily always achievable. So basically have this cognitive awareness, that's what we call it, but that's kind of a difficult term. I would just say, know what you know and know what you don't know. If you try to learn every detail in this course, you're going to have a hard time studying for the final. And I can assure you, I don't know every detail in this course, even though I wrote 90% of it. So what you want to know is, you want to be aware, what did you study, what were you comfortable with, what did you do well, and what are the things that you can handle, but it's a little tougher, and what are the things where you're like, okay, this is a little bit outside of my comfort zone. If you have that, and then you tackle the ones that you think are that you know best first, you're going to do pretty well in this exam, I can assure you. So exam strategy is important, and so and that's why we cover it very explicitly in this review part on the course. So this whole unit 7224 is about exam strategy. And it basically is a long version of what I just gave you as an explanation. But I do want you to kind of be aware of how difficult certain questions are. You also know how much time you have, how many questions there are. So you also should have some sense about where you should approximately be over time. Now, what I can tell you in advance of this exam, I can't tell you what's in it, but I can tell you that the questions do not get harder. You should spend about the same amount of time on each question. Some questions are a little harder than others, so it averages out. But if you are halfway through the time, but you've only done a quarter of the questions, you're going to be in trouble. So you have to have some mental awareness of where you are in terms of the exam. Okay, so that's on exam strategy. But I think this is actually the most important thing, especially in a course like this. I am totally aware that that the material in this course there's a lot of material in this course, and so you have to cover a lot of bases. But the ones of you who will be most successful at this are the ones who have this mental awareness of what they know, what they don't know. They go through the exam, they figure out which questions they can actually answer the best, and they have an awareness of how much time every single question should take. So the other thing that happens very commonly is that people get obsessed with one question and they get stuck in it. So remember, if you don't know it, move on. First, do all the things that you do know. Even if you go to a question where you thought it was obvious, then you reread it and you're like, oh, maybe it's not that obvious. Okay, skip it and go to the next one. You can always revisit it. Exam review done, or at least, exam strategy done. Of course, when you have a strategy and you can kind of know the basic outline of the course, now it's a matter of filling in some of the details that you need to know. And I want to spend the rest of this office hour kind of going over some details that I think are important. Now, they're not necessarily indicative for what's going to be on the exam. But together with what I'm telling you today on the office hour and all the practice exercises, I think you'll get a very good hint. So in order to kind of follow up on a discussion board post, let me show you that discussion board post, and then we'll go from there. So several of you asked, will we have a study guide for the final or some better guidance on what to focus on? I think you'll now realize I'm trying to address that question from the discussion board right here in the office hour. But I do also want to emphasize what Alberto, the TA for the course, answered, and which is that there won't be a review section. So this is not necessarily a review section this office hour, but I will say that I think both what it does is it's giving you roughly a review and a study guide prior to the exam. But we can't specifically tell you what to prioritize, obviously, and what's on the exam. But I hope that this addresses some of the concerns you have when you make this discussion board post, and I hope it helps you prepare. So then you've done exam strategy. The other two things in this review section is there's the whole glossary for the course. It's literally all the definitions. Of course, it's hard to learn this by heart, and I wouldn't necessarily want you to learn everything by heart, but there will be some glossary questions on the finals, just like they're on the quizzes. On the final, just like they're on the quizzes. So at least make sure you understand most of them. Now, the easiest way to learn that is to just go through all the flashcards. This one has all the flashcards in it that are part of the course and are part of the glossary. It does also contain the ones from before the midterm. So it doesn't really help you practice for the final. It also helps you review some of the stuff for the midterm, reviews the whole course. So that's kind of for you to help you think through all the course material. So the glossary and the flashcards really help you with those questions that just ask you for terms and definitions. Then you're, of course, left with the other questions. And those will be largely reflected by the ones that you've seen at the end of every single subsection and every single quiz. So the exam is we literally base most of the exam questions. They're not literal questions from the quizzes, but they're very closely related. So that said, let's just do one more thing before the end of this office hour, and let's go over some of the kind of the broader course material, and where I think the main things I want you to learn from this course, and that obviously also points you to the main things that I would focus on when I was making the exam. So let's get back to the actual online content rather than my face. So here's the course. Let me emphasize that this course is displayed as staff. So this is the view that I have as your professor, and it's slightly different than the view that you have. But all the elements I discuss are obviously also elements you have access to. I'm browsing down, so basically the midterm was here after part 3. So then we covered part 4, where we did market inefficiencies and public policies, where we looked at the 3 markets with notorious markets with imperfections. Now let me not spend any time on this office hour to go over that again. I did that last time already. So if you're interested in my view on what's important in this part, please go and check out the previous office hour for that. Same true for the labor market. I showed you several examples of labor market and unemployment. So then the first thing that it's useful doing is to think about part 5.1 and government spending, taxes, and debt. Let me see whether I have the circular flow diagram still up and running. Yeah, I do. Good. So part 5 really is about the government and the money flows that are coming into the government. That's government revenue, and outlays of the government. Those are either transfers or goods and services the government purchase. So transfers really just are as money that flows into the government, and the government then redistributes it to other people. It's the redistributive role of the government rather than the spending part of the government. That's the G in the national income accounting identity. So you could look at taxes. Those are income for the government, and then the outlays are transfers and government purchases. And so part 5 is organized like that. It's organized basically by looking at the outgoing arrows, government purchases and transfers for the government, and then looking at the incoming arrow, taxes for the government. Let's click on the spending part 5.1 to first. So there's a video, and then there is the actual government purchases. This part focuses on the government purchases, and this part focuses on the transfers that the government does. So in the bigger picture, what I'd like you to understand is that part 5.1 is really about this part of the circular flow diagram, and just splits it up into different units. Now, the discussion of taxes and transfers, the discussion of spending, so government purchases and transfers, largely just discusses different items the government spends money on, no matter whether it's the purchases that the government does. So think of stuff the government buys to build infrastructure or for national defense purposes, and the transfers, which are largely Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid in the United States. Then the next thing that's covered is taxes. And basically what needs to happen is that the government needs to pay for the spending it does, and it needs to generate revenue, and it does so in the form of taxes. And this part consists of basically, this section consists of three subparts. And the first one is the most important, 5132. So if you're reviewing stuff for the final, that's the most important one. The next one wants to make the point, well, the next one, the fiscal policy trade-off, makes the point that there's, taxes come with their own costs and their own distortions, but they also come with their benefits that the government spending, their benefits to government spending. So there's a fiscal policy trade-off in the sense that there's a benefit and a cost to these decisions. There's not only a cost, and I think that's important. And the reason we've included this section here is because we tend to often think in a very lopsided way that if we pay income taxes or sales taxes, that there's only a cost to that, because we tend to forget there's a benefit to the government spending programs and the government transfer programs that your taxes flow into. Now, what exactly that benefit is largely, and how big you think it is largely, obviously depends on your political views and opinions, and I'm not here to tell you what to think on that, but I want you to be aware that these things, that we tend to often focus on the one side we're seeing on a day-to-day basis, whether it's the sales tax we're paying or the income tax we're paying, and we're forgetting about the benefits of some of the government programs that are backed up by that. And then the final part here is challenging you to think through this in a way that has to do with marginal analysis. And again, that's part of the fundamental principles covered in this course, is to make decisions based on marginal analysis. But let me focus here with you on taxes and distortions. And in particular, what I'd like you to be aware of is something called the lever curve. Let me go to the part that I want to cover. I thought I was hitting that. Almost immediately. I need to zoom out here a little. So the lever curve has to do with the fact that we tend to think that if we raise the tax rate in an economy, we're going to get more revenue. But that doesn't have to necessarily be the case, because when you raise taxes on certain activities, and this is an example where we raise the tax on working, namely the income tax that Adam pays. If you raise the income tax rate on Adam, he's just going to work less. And if you make it really high, there's actually no reason for Adam to work. I mean, if you make the income tax 100%, and for every hour that Adam works, he makes a wage, but he has to pay 100% of that wage. So on net, the actual hour that Adam works is not buying him any additional consumption. It's just making him lose the utility of the leisure utility that he gets. And so there's only a cost to working and no benefit in that case, and Adam will not work. Now, because Adam then doesn't work, you can raise 100% income tax on something, but there is no labor income over which income tax is being paid, and so the total revenue is actually, the total amount of taxes paid is actually zero, because the total amount of taxes paid, the total tax revenue, is the tax rate times the tax base. So that's true at 100%. Now at zero, the opposite is true. Adam works, and actually he works quite a lot, but he's not paying any taxes because there's no tax being levied on his labor income. He's very happy, is he? So what's happening here is, and what we wanted you to be aware of, and that's why we included this interactive, is that the tax rate affects, or think of it as distorts, Adam's labor supply decision, because it causes a wedge between what Adam takes home in pay and what he gets paid in pay by his employer. And that wedge is a distortion. And so, but most importantly, this thing is zero here and this is zero there, but in the middle, Adam actually pays some taxes. So Arthur Lever is an economist that pointed this out, and that who said, remember that if this is zero here and this is zero here and somewhere positive in the middle, then there basically is a peak somewhere. So you could, in principle, be in a world where if you lower tax rate, the government actually gets more tax revenue because the response that people have, the behavioral response to change in the tax rate, offsets the decline in the tax rate. This is totally uncontroversial economic theory. The controversy is how much people actually respond to changes in tax rates, and whether it actually is, whether we're on what side of the peak of the lever curve are we? Are we in a world where taxes are so high that if you lower them, tax revenue will go up? Or are we in a world where taxes are so low that if you raise taxes, tax revenue will go up? Now, in practice, we tend to be close to the peak for many estimates. When we look at, for example, city income taxes in different cities, and even some estimates across countries say we're close to the peak. Now, it's not really surprising because governments are probably trying to maximize the revenue that they get. But there you have it. That's the lever curve. Now, the lever curve doesn't only apply to income taxes. It basically applies to taxes in more general. But this is included to give you a sense that there's a cost to taxation. That cost is clearly that Adam gets less happy the higher, more taxes he pays because he takes less money home. But he's also going to change how much he works because the benefit of working declines when he pays a higher tax rate. So being aware of the existence of a lever curve and the distortions that taxes create is one of the things that I really want you to be aware of in this course. So that's one of the things that I hope you learn from the part on taxation. So besides the accounting for public finance and having outlays and revenue, also be aware that there's a particular cost to generating the revenue for the government because it affects our behavior. My apologies, I'm a little dehydrated. So. We've covered that for part 5.1. Let's look at some other parts in 5.1 that might be relevant. So then the next thing we look at is debt for the government. And there's not a lot in this section, but it basically boils to like this. Debt is a stock, and basically when we tax people, we generate revenue for the government, then that reduces the debt. It's an outflow out of the debt tub. The inflow is the interest payments we need to do on the existing debt, as well as other government spending outlays. That includes government purchases and transfer payments. So this part 5.1.4, covers the existence of government debt, the dynamics of government debt, and it makes one more point that I want you to be aware of. What we generally focus on is the size of this bathtub relative to the overall size of the economy, because what we're concerned about is that debt is going to increase to a level that we can't pay it back. And so one way to look at this is to think about what's the overall amount of economic activity that backs up the debt by the government that governs the economy. And so that's known as the debt to GDP ratio. And there's something very interesting about the debt to GDP ratio. In order for the debt to GDP ratio to decline, you don't necessarily have to run a surplus. It doesn't have to be that taxes are bigger than interest payments, than spending by the government. Instead, what has to be the case is that debt grows less fast than GDP. So an economy can actually have a stable debt to GDP ratio, even though it runs a deficit. So that was the other insight from 5.1.4.2. That was it. That was about as much as I wanted to take away from it. But I like this section. It also shows you different bathtubs of different sizes, and I think that's really fun to go through. But the main takeaway is basically that. And then there's some main facts on the government sector that you can just go over yourself. I cover these facts in the course because I think it's very useful for you to know them. And a lot of people have very different perceptions on the size of the government, the size of different types of spending, etc. So I'd like you to go over these facts, but I'm not sure how much I can actually review them in great detail. Just review them yourself, learn them, and get a better sense. Sorry, I'm clicking the wrong thing. So that's it. That's part 5.1. Part 5.2, to go all the way down. Part 5.2, really what part 5.2 does is what part 5.2 does is it basically asks what types of policies can the government implement in order to affect both the growth rate of GDP, the level of GDP, or to alleviate the business cycle fluctuations in the economy. Now, the ones that affect the growth rate or cause a permanent upward shift in the level of GDP, those are policies that we generally tend to call ones that have a long-run effect and a long-run goal, and the ones that try to alleviate the magnitude of business cycles and the depth of recession, those are called short-run or stabilization policies. So let's quickly review those two types of policies. I'm not going to go over the details, but let me help you review them with you. Let's go back to the course material. So we're looking at part 5.2. So part 5.2 just basically has two main sections to it. One is on the long-run effects of government decisions. And really, as you by now know, is that what really determines long-run outcomes in the economy is productivity growth and to some extent capital accumulation. And so most policies that focus on long-run effects on the economy have that flavor of trying to improve productivity, and that could be by, for example, building infrastructure and making us all more productive because there are more roads, there are more fiber optic cables that we can use in order to produce stuff, or we know more, we have more human capital, or we have better ideas that we can use to improve, or we have less to worry about because we feel more secure, and that helps us. So that's like national defense. So most of these policies focus on the technology side, directly or indirectly, what's going on in the economy now. Education actually focuses on the productivity itself of workers, but the other ones really focus on technology. This section then goes through these particular types of policy options the government has. It then also discusses not only the importance of capital deepening, the productivity of labor and technology, but also the importance of having institutions in place that allow all of these things to be used efficiently. So that's an education system, but it's also a judicial system that makes clear what the rules are in the economy, and most importantly, implements clear property rights across the economy. Now, this section discusses both domestic institutions as well as institutions across countries. Now, I want you to be aware of the importance of institutions, but there's not a hell of a lot of details in this subsection to know. Fundamentally understanding there's two different, the goal of long-run policies being largely productivity related and technology related, that's important. And then the final thing here discusses why it's so hard to get policies implemented that actually have to do with the government policies that pursue long-run goals. And this is inherent in a democracy where voters now really incur the cost today, pay the taxes today, but the benefits of these things, the benefit of building a road, the benefit of investing in R&D and improving technology, the benefits of improving education levels, those benefits all accrue in the longer run and occur in the future. So the cost is today, and the benefits are in the future, the returns are in the future of these investments. And that causes a difference that is often a tension in political decisions. So that's on the long run effects of government decisions. And then there's a part on the short run policies that the government implements. And these are short run policies related to economic activity. There are the short run policies, obviously, but this is a class of macroeconomics. And really, since the Great Depression, economists have thought a lot about what is the cost of recessions? What's the cost of business cycles? And the Great Depression and in 2008, the Great Recession are two very deep troughs in economic activity where we're always reminded how big the cost is of recessions to people in the economy. And so in the wake of the Great Depression, there's one particular economist who thought a lot about this, and he was called John Maynard Keynes. And so people who advocate for certain types of stabilization policies that would slow down or that would alleviate business cycles are often called Keynesian economists, or kind of the Keynesian school. But it's largely because of the way they think about what's causing these recessions and these business cycle fluctuations. Now, what I want you to take away from this part on stabilization policies, let me not go through the parts in detail here, is I want you to take away that no matter whether you're Keynesian or non-Keynesian, there's basically, through the circular flow diagram, three things the government can do in order to stimulate overall economic activity. One is to make transfer payments. Right? There's basically, besides government debt, there's three arrows. Two of them go out from the government sector out to the rest of the economy, namely government purchases or transfer payments. And there's one coming into the government sector, that's taxes. So how can the government stimulate overall activity? By basically manipulating those three arrows around, the size of those three arrows. So one option would be to increase the size of transfer payments. That would give individuals more money to spend. The spending would result in more production. The production would result in more income. And this would basically influence the amount of blood in circulation in the bloodstream called the circular flow diagram. So that's the one instrument. Now, for example, unemployment insurance benefits that people get when they lose their job in recessions, that's a transfer payment. And it's there, it automatically sets in, so it's sometimes called an automatic stabilizer when the economy is in a downturn. So that's on the transfer side. And then the other thing the government can do is generate more production that then generates more income, and that generates more spending that generates more production, and kind of influence the circular flow diagram that way. That could be done by government purchases, for example, investing in infrastructure in downturns. And increase government spending on other programs in downturns. Now, that was done after the 2008 recession, but it's done often after recession in recession. So that's a government spending stimulus to the economic activity. And then the third one would be, instead of doing this directly through giving people more income through transfer payments, or directly increasing production through spending by the government, the third one is to basically reduce the amount of taxes people pay. That will increase their disposable income. It will increase their spending. And that's another way of doing it. So all of these three levers can be moved. And often they're all moved at the same time. That happened, for example, in 2008, in the wake of the Great Depression. And sometimes some levers are moved more in recessions than others. For example, in the 2001 recession, a large part of the stimulus that was passed was mainly through tax cuts rather than and through tax rebates rather than through government spending or through transfer payments. But that really depends. At the end, what I want you to take away from this thing, this part on stabilization policies is that a lot of these discussions on stabilization policies call someone Keynesian or non-Keynesian, and people are very kind of label. They like to talk about labels, but really at the end, fundamentally, when you look at the circular flow diagram, it's pretty obvious. You either reduce taxes or you increase either government spending through government purchases or through transfer payments. And no matter what you do, if the other arrows stay the same, that means that you're going to have either more spending in the same amount of revenue or less revenue and the same amount of spending, or you could have even less revenue and more spending. That happens a lot because the revenue in the recession also declines because the tax base declines. And all of that then results in a bigger deficit and an increased buildup of government debt. That's a very natural thing that happens during recessions. Now, at the moment in the United States, we're also running a deficit. But remember, we're not in a recession. We're actually doing very well. We're in a very strong economy. And that's, that's something that is very different from the type of stabilization policies that people advocate, where the size of the deficit that the government runs moves over the business cycle. And in fact, some people would advocate for running small deficits or even surpluses during expansion and running bigger deficits during downturns. But at the moment, we're running a big deficit, even though we're in the middle of an expansion. So not about stabilization policies. That's covered part 5.2. Part 6.1. Let's go back to the course. On part 6.1, as I told you already before, there's not a lot that I want to review. There's just learn about what the roles of money are. Learn about different types of money in the economy in part 6.1.2. These are things you can easily learn yourself and learn by heart. So those are not particularly complicated concepts. Then the next thing is the classical dichotomy and hyperinflation. And what I want you to take away from this is that fundamentally, if money does not influence overall economic activity, the rate of inflation, so this is a belief, so let me just click this part and I'll talk you through each of these individual subsections. So the first point that this part makes is that if prices, interest rates, and wages all adjust immediately in an economy, then money doesn't necessarily have any role. In fact, the only thing that it does, it's basically a measure of account, or just accounting in dollar terms, or in euros, or in pesos, depending on where you are in the world. So it's a unit of account. And everything else is just accounted in this unit, and there's no other role for money. Now, this is sometimes known as the classical dichotomy, because what it implies is that that there is no money itself in the economy is just a unit of account. It doesn't affect the allocation of resources in the economy beyond just how many dollars we're accounting for. Now, if you believe that money has very little influence on output, which is what Milton Friedman largely believed, then you can actually, that implies an interesting result, which is if you believe money doesn't influence output, but it also doesn't really influence how it's the rate at which it circulates in the economy is also not really affected by how much money is in circulation or how high interest rates are, then what determines the inflation, the growth rate of the price level, is largely just the growth rate of money. And this is the monetarist view. This is the quantity equation of money that's covered in this part. And so the monetarist view is that money growth determines inflation. And this is true in countries where money growth is really fast. Now, in other countries like the US or in Europe, these effects, that money doesn't affect output and doesn't really affect the velocity of money, those effects turn out that those are not necessarily zero. The monetarist view just says that if these effects are small, then it must largely be that money growth causes inflation. And so this relationship between money growth and inflation is one that economists often emphasize. Now, the way to think about this is that if you basically print more money, then inflation goes up, and the value of holding money over time goes down, because basically inflation reduces the value of money. So you can interpret inflation as a tax. And so that's what Part 613 is about. The government could potentially print money, reduce the value of the money that's already there, use the money it prints in order to actually finance some of its spending, and think of that as revenue. It actually has a name, it's called seigniorage revenue. But that seigniorage revenue comes at the cost of imposing a tax on all the money that's already in circulation. So Part 613 goes over this, that if you have high money growth, you're actually imposing, if you have money growth or inflation that causes inflation, then the money growth can be used to finance government spending, but it imposes a tax on money holdings. And then it goes and gives an example of hyperinflation in Brazil, and there's very little I can say about it, but Fernanda Necchio, who's a co-author of mine, an economist at the San Francisco Fed, will tell you a little bit about her personal experience with inflation in Brazil. Now, the final part of this discusses when money is not neutral, when the classical dichotomy does not hold, and that is when interest rates, wages, and prices do not adjust immediately to changes in economic circumstances. In those cases where they don't adjust immediately, there's cases where the economy is subject to what we call nominal rigidities, but it's really a complicated word for a slow adjustment of everything that's accounted for in terms of dollar terms or whatever currency you use. That's the most important part of 6.1. The other things, learn them kind of the different definitions of M1, M2, M3. They're relevant. They could potentially be on the final. But conceptually, this is the most important thing I want you to take away from it. So do read Right on the Money, which is about different ways of measuring the money supply. It's a favorite thing to ask, and just go through it. It's relatively easy to learn. Now, I'm kind of running out of time, but let me discuss a few more things here. The next thing talks about banks and bank runs, and that's in 6.2. I want you to understand the bank balance sheet. I want you to understand why banks are subject to bank runs. And I want you to understand why the policy measures that the Federal Reserve has, which is the reserve requirements, the discount rate, basically the Federal Reserve's ability to lend money to banks at a discount rate, and the Federal Reserve's influence on the cost of holding reserves through the federal funds rate are all helping to stabilize the banking system and potentially prevent bank runs. And then on top of that, there's the FDIC, and the FDIC will also help prevent bank runs by ensuring deposits that people have. Now, the next thing in part 6.2 is talking about through the Federal Reserve System, and that's just generally talking through the particular ways that the Fed can implement both, pursue the stability of the financial system, and then also affect the price of reserves that banks pay, or the cost of holding reserves. And that affects the short-term interest rate. Now, then 6.2.4 is about monetary policy. That's a long part in which we explicitly go through all the model that shows you how, or illustrates how, the Fed can set short-term interest rates. And when you lower short-term interest rates, that makes when the interest rate's lower, it makes saving less attractive, so people will consume more, and that consumption drives up short-term demand, drives up C, and C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Lower interest rate also makes the cost of investing lower. Think of the user cost equation of capital. So it will also drive up I, and C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So what you can do, what the Federal Reserve can do, is it can move the interest rate around and stimulate demand, and move the demand curve, or in that case, the aggregate demand curve in the economy. 624 is a very long section, but I think it's pretty self-contained. I recorded a lot of videos for you that do basically a review that I would otherwise do in this office hour. So go through section 6.24, and you'll basically learn the model with all the questions related to it. Because it's so complicated, it is covered on the final, but it is covered only in a limited number of questions. So then we're in section 6.25, which is on the financial crisis, and it starts with a little video of me telling a personal story, and then it illustrates how you don't only can have a bank run of depositors removing their money from other banks, but you can also have a bank run of the bank system on itself by having banks basically not lend money to each other, and how the mortgage financial crisis of 2008, or people stopping to pay off their mortgages because of the housing bubble bursting in the US, caused such a run of the banking system on itself. So go through that. Largely, that will help you understand a lot of the other parts, and it then discusses how the central bank decided on a slightly different way of implementing monetary policy. If I would prioritize 6.2, I would focus very much on 2.2, 2.3, 2.4, and use 2.5 to kind of put all the concepts that you've learned in context. And that brings us to the final part, which is part 7.1. And part 7.1 has accounting for international transactions in it. And I'd like you to know this, and I'd like you to know this well. It's definitely also covered in the final. And what it does is it covers something called the national savings identity, and it goes in the RISE debt. So study 7.1 too well. It really covers a lot of things. It has the circular flow diagram again, and that's also a favorite topic to ask for on exam. So be aware of that. Then 7.13 is about trade and the gains of trade. That's one of the most fundamental insights, as the course material already says. I recorded a lot of videos to illustrate the interactive to you. Go over them, understand what they do. It's one of my favorite interactives, and that is also reflected in some of the coverage on the final. Then 7.14 is about exchange rates. Again, I recorded a whole bunch of smart short videos on those to review the course content there. But there's a few things you should kind of understand. Understand the market that drives exchange rates. What is the market? And it's a weird market. It's a market where you sell one currency to buy another currency and the other way around. So there's basically the demand side is people who buy one currency, who want to exchange, currency A for currency B, and the supply side is the people who want to do the opposite, exchange currency B for currency A. So this is a little bit of a complicated thing. How do you define an exchange rate? And then what's the market that generates where this is an equilibrium price? But once you learn to think in terms of the market that determines exchange rates, that's really helps. Now, the other thing that is really important on this exchange rate part, and that is it's covered really extensively. This part on exchange rates is largely taken from another textbook that is listed in the course material, and it's a little long, but I like that part. It's very well written, and I can't add much to it. But the one is to understand how we define an exchange rate. That there's two ways: the price of one currency in terms of another, or the times of the price of another currency in terms of this one currency, and the same is with the market. So these things can flip around, but they have the same interpretation. So go through this. It's a little confusing. I recorded a bunch of videos for you on that. And the final thing is to understand that we often talk about a stronger dollar, and we think that that is good for everyone, but it's not. And so a large part of that section actually discusses, who benefits and who benefits from an appreciation when the dollar gets stronger, and who doesn't benefit from that, who actually pays the price for that. Understanding who benefits from a stronger currency and who suffers under a stronger currency is important, and you will learn a lot about that in 714. If you get those things down, the market that drives exchange rates, kind of how we measure them, and who benefits and who suffers under an appreciation, then you got 714 down. And 715 shows you a whole bunch of facts on inflation. Of course, these facts questions are easy to ask. So remember, browse through them. Don't have to remember every detail, especially on those facts. Remember the broad picture. Know what you know what you don't know when they get asked on the exam. Just ask yourself, is this one of those facts where I'm pretty sure about? Then I'm going to do it first. If not, I'll wait for it and I'll revisit this question and I'll do it later. Okay, that kind of completes this review session, and I hope it helps. I hope this is kind of a rough study guide. Again, I can only give you rough pointers, and I think I've done that here on kind of what are the main takeaways of each of the sections, with what takeaways in mind I've written them, and where I think you could focus on more or less in terms of the details. I hope this helps. I hope this helps you prepare for the exam. We're looking forward to see how you're doing, and we will we will see you soon and see your performance soon. I hope you enjoy going through part 7.1. I know it's a little long, but there is no second part to week 7 because the second part is the review part that helps you with the exam. So good luck, and hopefully you'll all do really well in the course. Thank you.